Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review a movie called American Gigolo. When probably looking at this movie, I also know that there is a movie called Deuce Bigelow, Male Gigolo. The only thing is, this movie really doesn't quite exactly, like, the Deuce Bigelow movie doesn't exactly take a ton of stuff from this and make it uh really, I think there's kind of very few things that are otherwise tied to the Deuce Bigelow movie that is has any kind of reference to this. Everything else, it's on its own merit within that movie and this. So it's not like a blatant ripoff to me, honestly. With the exception of we have Richard Gere's character, who is of course uh, really a high end male that seemingly could reasonably get any woman that he wants, but kind of goes into a certain kind of portion of women, usually much older women, and ultimately it seems that he is getting the higher rise of women in the higher ways of life, which I think reasonably, I don't know if you could really actually do this movie in current time, modern time, unless you're really going to do a movie and it's just a lot of rich girls, no matter what age they are, and because ultimately you could probably get into the Fortune 500 of yeah, I'm gonna live in this portion of place because you probably have to have a gigolo that ultimately kind of goes from place to place to place to place to ultimately find the rich people and take money from them. And you probably wouldn't have to end up being a certain age range, because ultimately Julian, which is Richard Gere's character, ultimately is really tied to a older woman. But I guess reasonably rich could be any number of people. It doesn't have to be nowadays. It doesn't have to actually be seemingly the older that you are, the richer that you are, because that doesn't exactly make sense. But anyways, going into this movie, we have to where Richard Gere is a character that really wants to put in the work, really wants to really care about giving a woman what she's paid for, so to speak. Basically meaning that she has to get off, and ultimately, at some point, Richard Gere talks about being with a woman for seemingly 3 hours, and eventually, towards the end of that 3 hours, getting this woman off. And so ultimately, he is proud about that accomplishment. It's no one in the world would have probably taken that time, but I did because I cared, which is good for him. Um, Reasonably, I thought that this movie was just fascinating to me, and I don't think there was a lot going on in this movie, to be brutally honest. I thought that this movie, writing wise, was just really interesting, and the way of which that it doesn't always it's not an entire movie that concentrates on the whole gigolo thing. It eventually kind of goes into well, hey, how about we also have this story going on top of here as well, and eventually showcase that having this kind of lifestyle is going to eventually come back to bite you, I guess, in a karma like fashion of sorts. When going into this movie, I thought that there was so much intriguing things going on into here. Ultimately, seeing Hector Elizondo, Elizondo, I hope I'm saying that right. The guy that ultimately plays Sunday the detective. I'm like, man, it seems like him and Richard Gere are usually in so many movies together. I guess I'm assuming they're probably just best friends, and every time that maybe Richard Gere does a movie, then this guy does a movie. Because it seems like every time I've seen a Richard Gere film, I've seen this guy in there somewhere. Um, like go and watch the movie Runaway Brides, which is with Richard Gere and Julia Roberts. You'll find this guy in here. I think he was also in Pretty Woman as well. But anyways, so yeah, where can you see American Gigolo? Go out of your way to say that you finally saw this film on a Hulu. There probably isn't a lot of. There is at some point within this movie like a kind of quick bit of women that have less than normal amounts of clothes on, but I don't think reasonably like that is a big thing in this movie. So ultimately, if that's ultimately all that you want within this film, doesn't quite happen enough. Ultimately, if they probably did this in more current modern time, man, they would just be like montaging like women all kinds of sorts and just basically you couldn't probably avoid the declothing in probably more modern time movie, but really in here it was like the movie didn't need that. It was so fascinating. Um, Within its own merit that I was like, it doesn't garner like a heavily splashing of Richard Gere walking around showing his butt and whatever, or any number of people having to show off anything. Um, I just thought this story was good enough to uh, that it didn't need that, to be brutally honest. Really, the funniest thing that I thought about this movie, I'm like, man, did they use like one song in this movie and then they consistently try to like siphon it in repetitiously? Like, if anything, there's like a sad moment where they kind of have to try to like weirdly adjust the music to make it seem sad. But they're just kind of using the same song, the same Blondie Call Me song throughout this entire movie because that's ultimately, I guess, the only music that they could really tie themselves onto. So at first, the Call Me song actually plays, but then ultimately, every single thing after that is just the instrumental part of it. So I'm like, man, did they really like? And I thought it was weird. I guess supposedly in this movie there is a soundtrack. Okay, was it just like, hey, here's 30 versions of Call Me from Blondie in instrumental? I guess is the rest of the soundtrack because I can't believe that there is actually a soundtrack for this movie. That would blow my mind because ultimately I just heard the Blondie song and that's it. I couldn't believe that there's more actual songs than that to be used. But anyways, so going to this movie, I thought Richard Gere to me throughout this entire film was just a fascinating character. I think ultimately we have Richard Gere who seems to have learned like a ton of languages in this film, uh, or supposedly we are to led to believe. It seems that Richard Gere is really trying to tell us that he's like the highest end of this kind of gigolo thing. That reasonably there is no other man that would reasonably uh, do the things that he would uh, do, and so on and so forth. Um, yeah, it just I thought that Richard Gere was trying to pull off a character that I don't really like. It doesn't really feel like Richard Gere's character is quasi like he's really representing that his stuff doesn't stink, if you know what I mean. But when really looking at it, I was like, okay, like there's nothing that really seems to like really fully fledgedly tell me that Richard Gere is talking the walk, so to speak. Uh, it doesn't really seem like he is like he learned 5 languages or whatever, but it doesn't really show me that all of a sudden he's a very diverse person, that he's talking to all these people in all subtitle esh like things, like, oh, he has a Russian girl and he said one thing of Russian to her, and oh, he's speaking to a Czechoslovakian girl and he knows like Czech or something, or so on and so forth, like, oh, that is one of the 5 languages. Like, you would think that at some point they would have like had a montage of him just kind of talking to people that he wouldn't be able to normally. Um, but ultimately, we find out that Richard Gere seems to be showing some talent of some language, and ultimately he is learning a language while being in this movie. So I don't know. I thought there was I think really a bulk of the point, the first half of this was really fascinating to me, and then once we actually get into the switch of this movie, to where there's a switching in story, because ultimately we find out that Richard Gere's life is eventually going to go into a dangerous twist. There has to be some scandal. There has to be some mystery afoot, and so Richard Gere has to be otherwise tied to that, and because ultimately you can kind of do so many underhanded things, and I guess Richard Gere, I guess, wouldn't be able to normally say no to certain kind of parameters or certain kind of deals of sorts. Like, he just does them and just like, meh, I guess I just did that deal. So pushing on, I think that's all I need to say about this within non-spoiler terms, because I feel like I'm almost quasi. The more I talk about it, I'm kind of giving away a lot of the movie, or just kind of getting close to giving away the movie, so I won't have much to talk about in spoiler terms. So let's ultimately go, and ultimately I'll say I liked this movie, but um, when looking at it, like, I wish that there would have been like a little bit more of the whole Gigolo thing and less about the like, oh, there's got to be a twist in this movie. There's got to be a hook dealio that's going on in this film. And now, like, Richard Gere's life is going in turmoil, and oh my god, what's gonna happen to him? Because reasonably, like, I thought like that was the. I was like, man, you could have had Richard Gere like had this whole story, and like ultimately you could have maybe had Richard Gere be in almost like a love octagon or something, like a love like triangle of sorts, or something where it's like everybody is just like, you have it to where like a woman gets so infatuated with Richard Gere that ultimately she is going to uh like she gets a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, and I think that would have been great. I think that would have been a better story instead of where eventually this leads. Um, because ultimately it would be interesting to eventually have a client who eventually gets possessive. Because ultimately, I'm assuming Richard Gere does have clients that are repeaters. Because ultimately, they mentioned full well in the beginning of that. Where ultimately, Richard has eventually, or Julian's character has people that come back. So, if anything, let's go into that sweet, delicious double five to otherwise go, chicken, and ultimately talk about American Gigolo. So, let's go to spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time to spoil this movie who that is ultimately on Hulu. If you haven't seen it, ultimately at the end of the day, it might not be forever be on Hulu. It might just be on there for a brief time. But take the time and go and watch this movie. I thought that it was just good enough. At the end of the day, you could probably go out of your way to, if you don't have a Hulu subscription, you could probably go on any number of movie apps. There, in fact, a Movie Pro or Movie Playbox or Movie Box or whichever freaking thing that you probably could find. But ultimately, if you just put in the thing called Movie App, you could probably there, in fact, find any number of free sources that ultimately at the end of the end, at the end of the day, you could say that you could watch any of these things if you would enjoy any portion of these movies. So it's about that time. Let's talk about spoilers. So we have it to our Richard, of course, Gere, ultimately being this, like, just handsome of a man. And that's weird to say. Because ultimately, like, you could kind of, like, you can really assess that it's like, yeah, like, Richard Gere is this guy who, like, he walks in a room and all the girls are like, yeah, that guy, yeah, delish. Whatever, whichever, what have you. So, weirdly enough, then Richard Gere, every single thing that he does past this point, uh, with the exception of maybe a few Good Men or whatever that movie is called, the movie where he like is the I got nowhere else to go. I liked him in that movie, and I liked him in this movie. Pretty Woman, he's just kind of there because Julia Roberts is kind of like she really like man did she like every time she's in a room with anybody, it's just like just move over anybody else. Julia Roberts is here, and so recently you're just like infatuated with her in that movie, as well as usually any single movie that she's ever been in. It's just like move over anybody else that is in a Julia Roberts movie because Julia Roberts is in here. So who cares about anybody else, with the exception of Eat, Pray, Love, where you see her eat way too much, and you're just like, ugh, I'm sick of Julia Roberts. But any other movie with Julia Roberts in it, fine. But anyways, Eat, Pray, Love is an endeavor, but ultimately, Wonder Woman 1984 kind of changed my thoughts about barely about Eat, Pray, Love, and man, is that just a barely that I could bear not to barely, anyways, bearing on. Talking about American Gigolo, not anything that Julia Roberts is doing, or Wonder Woman 1984, because that's a moot point. So, American Gigolo, we ultimately have Richard Gere, who is ultimately going to his pimp lady. Ultimately, we see two women that are sunbathing with nothing on, which is thumbs up for that movie. I wish we could have seen a little bit more skin in this movie, but it doesn't need it. Like I would have just like just just top half of any woman would have been nice, but whatever. Me. Could have been a scene where ultimately Gear is gearing down on a woman, if you know what I mean, and ultimately you just kind of like you see some topplage and that's it. That would have been fine in this movie, but that sucks. But anyways, so we eventually have Richard Gere ultimately haggling with his pimp, ultimately to split his pay 50-50. Which ultimately I'm just like, why would this pimp need 50-50? It's like, man, like, you would think if this woman is getting all these ladies and or men, you would think that she wouldn't need like 50-50. You would have thought to be like, okay, well, I like finder's fee, but ultimately you're doing all the work, so how about 30-70? 30-70. But anyways, we find that Richard Gere's character, Julian, is like, well, hey, well, like, if anything, like, I've made you a crap ton of money, and, but evidently Julian's pimp is ultimately just like, well, yeah, but you kind of cut me out of the repeaters, the people that will come back to you. And it's like, yeah, but, like, dude, like I have several qualifications. How many of your men ultimately can get you into the country clubs and all these other places? Because I am a high end man. I am high in demand, and ultimately, I've learned 5 languages right now. And ultimately, we have Julian's pimp that's ultimately asking, is like, well, how is your Swedish? Are you gonna date Pootie Pie? how is your Swedish? This woman just keeps asking, how is his Swedish? And Julian's just like, well, it's coming along. It's hard. It's hard learning Swedish. Because ultimately we have Julian's pimp that ultimately is going to, I think, Anne. I could be wrong about this. Nina Van Paladin. I'm probably wrong about the name. Anyways, the girl is asking about his Swedish because ultimately it seems that Richard Gere is going to have a girl fly in that ultimately only speaks Swedish, and that is going to be his like high end woman. Because we have it to where what Richard Gere does is he ends up trying to find women that can't speak English to try to be their translator and or their guide, let's just say. But he guides them into a little bit more than just like, hey, well, here's the buffet, here's the toilets. No, he's gonna guide them into the bedroom, let's just say. Um, because we have it to where ultimately uh, Richard Gere some ends up going into some lavish like bar after uh, after going and substituting for some limo driver. So not only does Richard Gere like do a little uh, double dipping with like so he does some seduction of sorts, but really he also is also a limo driver, which he barely does. I guess he does a lot of odd jobs because ultimately at the end of this movie, like Richard Gere, Julian is mentioning, is like, well, hey, like I'm getting a little older. If anything, I'm also gonna go to Leon and ultimately ask if ultimately I can get some tricks from him and ultimately do some jobs for him. Um, so we have Julian, who's ultimately a double agent, who's having two different pimps have him do two different jobs, and I guess to ultimately see if ultimately he can kind of pivot between these pimps, and it seems like that is going to eventually rub either one of these pimps the wrong way. Um, but anyways, we have Julian that ultimately does this job with this older woman, and it seems that ultimately we are led to quite possibly have this older woman maybe want a little bit more than just a limo ride, if you know what I mean. Um, but I don't think it's quite led or head up to that exactly. But anyways, we push on to have Richard Gere eventually go to this bar and eventually hear a woman that is speaking some delicious French. And so ultimately, Richard Gere, out of the 8,500 languages that he knows, French is actually one of them. So he starts speaking French to what is a girl named Michelle, and ultimately played by Lauren Hutton, which ultimately I've seen in several other movies, but ultimately this one, ultimately for me, I would just assess that it's Michelle. So, anyways, we have it to where Richard Gere is speaking French, and there is no subtitles at the bottom of this movie, and I'm like, what the f? I want to know what they're saying, even if it's not in the language of English. I want to have subtitles, mother effer. Why aren't you having subtitles in this movie? What kind of garbage is this? American Gigolo? I want to know that they're whispering sweet nothings to one another in French. I want to know what they're saying. What are the f of this movie? But anyways, so we ultimately find out that Michelle ultimately speaks English, and ultimately Richard Gere's like, "Oh, so you do speak English?" And she's like, "Yeah," and he's like, "Oh, well, that's too bad." Because reasonably, I was hoping that I could be your translator and or your guide. And ultimately, at some fee, I would be able to just, give you a little good nightcap, if you know what I mean. We have it to where Michelle ultimately is like, well, like, I'm also going to tell you that I'm married, and ultimately she is married to some seemingly political figure or some senator or something like that. And ultimately, Richard Gere is kind of turned off by all this, and he's like, just like, well, like, I don't even know, like, I guess, like, this is all wrong for me to try to go here. And Michelle is ultimately just kind of fascinated, and she's like, well, how much is an effin? How much would you like how much would you actually like how much do women actually pay you for one good effin? And so, like, recently at first, like, we have kind of Michelle kind of playing with the fact of just kind of like seeing uh like seeing how this guy is. And but ultimately Richard Gere, Julian's character, ultimately just kind of like fluffs off this woman and just kind of like, well, yeah, I guess this is like a deal that didn't actually work out. Like, there was no way that this was going to work out perfectly. And plus, she's tied to a political figure and so on and so forth. We're going to kind of see that it seems like there are like points in which where Julian is kind of in hot water with a lot of numbers of people, and there's going to be scandals and so on and so forth. Um, but anyways, we eventually have it to where Julian is trying to ultimately make some other deals, ultimately make some other tricks, let's just say, ultimately make some other jobs, and we find out that Michelle ultimately stalks him and finds out where he lives. Ultimately, Michelle asks uh, Julian, it's like, oh, is this where you take all your women? Like, I would assume that it would have been like you would have had a mirrored wall and like all these kinds of other like red carpet and all this other stuff. And like Julian's like, I'm sorry, I don't take my women here. This is my place. It's like, if anything, like, no, I'm not gonna take them to my place and do a little banging, do a little bang a bang, bang a bang bang. No. So ultimately Michelle is just like, well, like, I'd find where you live, and I ultimately am just like trying to like stop myself from ravishing you right now, because ultimately I'm just thinking about what we had said before, and ultimately that I have money to give you if ultimately you want to get the bargain of which you had mentioned before, and so on and so forth. And to where ultimately we lead into ultimately these two people seemingly getting a good night effing, and this is to lead to them like repetitiously like getting together to the point to where it seems like they are a really good couple, oddly enough. And it seems that Richard Gere is going to really fall for this girl, Michelle. But anyways, so we eventually have Richard Gere, Julian, doing all kinds of other jobs for women. At some point, we have it to where there is a couple that ultimately wants these services of Julian, and Julian's ultimately just like, well, dude, I don't do guys. Like, ultimately, he says a much more uh, other word of which that I won't repeat here because I don't like that word. I don't like to use that word. But ultimately, like, Julian is ultimately talking to the husband of this couple, and ultimately he's talking that he's like, dude, I don't do guys, like, and like I don't do like couples. And ultimately it's like, well, the husband mentions like, well, you're not going to be doing anything with me, you're going to be doing something with my wife, but I'm going to watch, of course. And and Richard Gere is like, well, yeah, of course you are, like, of course. So we have it uh to where Richard Gere ends up going into the room ultimately after getting paid beforehand. And so ultimately he ends up starting his way into talking to this woman, telling her that he's very qualified in being able to please her, evidently. And so ultimately he starts to uh, to get to the quasi like, oh, I'm definitely going to take care of you, and the entire time we have the husband like shouting out commands in the background where he's just like, turn her over, slap her, and do this all kinds of other stuff, and you can just see Richard Gere just getting more and more just ticked off, looking back at him like, are you freaking kidding me? So we ultimately lead to that weird, bizarre scene. To ultimately, Julian is ultimately talking to Leon and ultimately telling that this trick that ultimately he had to pull was a horrible trick or dirty trick. How could you have done that to me? And so, reasonably, we have it to where ultimately we have it to where Julian is consistently like at some points like he's just kind of hanging out with women, just kind of having fun with them. At one point, he's going to like some art gallery with some girl. Ultimately, he almost like breaks some like uh, expensive artwork. Like he seems like he's going to break it on purpose, just to make some person gasp. To ultimately, he walks out of this art gallery and like him and this girl are just laughing. Anyways, we find out that Julian likes older women because older women are much more of a challenge. Ultimately, he talks to Michelle, and ultimately he says like, yeah, like I don't like any of the younger girls. Ultimately, it's like there's no challenge in that. There's no like yeah, I could probably easily get them all off, and it would be great and whatever. But it would just feel like a shallow attempt for me and this and that. It's not challenging enough. It's not like a real true like this guy like takes like every single bedroom business moment as like a quest of sorts. It's weird. But ultimately, when looking at it, I can respect that also. Or ultimately, he's talking about like the challenge of um, taking 3 hours to please a woman because ultimately she uh, hadn't been with a man in so long or had her husband um, pleased her in so long that it took numerous hours to be able to accomplish that goal. Um, and ultimately he was pleased with himself for being able to take numerous hours to do that because ultimately like that's the whole kind of romanticism of it, and I think that's what uh, Julian ultimately likes is the real true romanticism of it because ultimately it feels like every time Julian does any task with a woman it ultimately is really tied into like a romantic kind of thing. Like it's not just some kind of, it's not like he's trying to, like he's really trying to give these women what they pay for, and that is really romance, really, to be brutally honest. Like it's intimacy at a level of which that would placate that he is their boyfriend in some kind of way. But ultimately there is the untyingness of sorts that ultimately goes on with that as well. So we ultimately seem to eventually have it to where seemingly one of Julian's cases ultimately goes horribly awry. To ultimately, we have this detective Sunday that seems to need to go to Richard Gere and ask him, like, hey, where were you on so and so day? Where were you? Because it seems that we find that the woman that ended up getting into the bedroom with her husband while Julian was doing his act, ultimately that led into a very vicious and or bad way, and ultimately led to have that case come back to uh, Julian's doorstep. So we ultimately have it to where ultimately we have this detective that is consistently uh, questioning Julian. It seems like Sunday is ultimately asking him, it's like, well, hey, how do you like how is it that you just like can get all these women, and how can you do this lifestyle? How is it that like, and so funny enough, we have it to where Julian is ultimately like giving Sunday like pointers and ultimately like talking about like how he can better himself and all this stuff. And I like that moment. I thought that was kind of cool. We ultimately have it to where Sunday is ultimately going to because ultimately we have one point where Sunday comes in on Julian getting his shoes buffered or shoes shined, and so ultimately uh, Julian makes the joke to Sunday. It's like, well, hey, like if you're already gonna sit over there, my other shoe needs a pretty good shining. Or ultimately just basically like mentioning to Julian mentioning to Sunday, it's like, well, hey, how about you get your shoes shined and whatever. Um, but anyway, like there was some like funny banter between consistently Julian and Sunday, and I liked that. That was really enjoyable. Those scenes that they had there. But anyways, so we ultimately have Sunday, who is like he's trying very much not to pin Julian for this murder, because ultimately this girl had gone missing. But ultimately, it seems like there's no other suspects. It's to the point where ultimately Sunday is gonna want to have Julian go uh, for a God, what is it called? A lineup to ultimately see if ultimately he'll get pointed out by anybody. And so Julian goes to that, and ultimately he's telling the guy that's next to him, it's like, "Hey man, I'm getting paid $15." And like, are you getting paid anything? And the guy's like, no, like I'm a criminal. And Julian's like, well, I'm getting paid $15, and that guy over there, he's getting paid $20. So this guy is just like outraged and is like, dude, I'm not getting paid anything for this. What the f? What's going on? So I thought that that was kind of a like an interesting moment. Told me get this guy to just try and stop this lineup from happening. So ultimately, we have Julian that is kind of desperate to have some alibi for this murder. Because ultimately, it seems that Julian gives an alibi for for that day, but that day was only like till 7 o'clock, and ultimately the murder happened at 10. So we have it to ultimately like Julian needs a desperate alibi. Told me he's trying to come to his pimps. Told me say, hey, I need an alibi for this. Like, hey, help me out. And his pimps are just like, dude, you've done me wrong. Like, nah. Like, if anything, you've been garbage to me. You've been treating me like crap lately. So I'm not gonna help you. Like, nah. Like, sucks to be you. Like, you put yourself in hot water, and like I just am not gonna save you. We ultimately have it to where Leon is ultimately going to try and help him, but no, he's kind of like just he's kind of really milking this out, and it seems like uh, Julian is coming to the consensus of like, Leon, why aren't you helping me with this? Like, why aren't you like moving faster to get me an alibi? And Leon's like, yeah, I don't know, like, nah, like, how do I got things to do? So many things. Um, because we ultimately find out that like Julian is seemingly in the middle of a scandal with a political figure, and ultimately it's just like Julian is basically effed, really and truly effed. It gets to the point where ultimately Julian is being followed by one of the people from the senator's office, and ultimately Julian slaps a marker on somebody's head to tell them, like, dude, this is my phone number. Get him to call me and ask him anything that you need about me. Like, why do you have to sneak around? Like, no, just call me up, ask me anything that the senator wants to know. Like, we'll meet face to face, and I will tell him everything, which I thought was really great. Because I'm like, yeah, I'm like, you know what? Like, I hate all this kind of like underhanded, like I'm gonna sneak around and stalk this person and find out information about him. Like, no, just come right to the source and ultimately ask this mother effer anything that you have about him. He'll tell you. Because Richard Gere in this movie is that kind of guy, where it's like he's gonna tell you everything that he knows and whatever. Um, but it seems that Julian is almost going to be tied to this murder. And so reasonably, like, Julian is just kind of desperate to just find some way out of this whole thing, this whole problem that he's having. So we ultimately have it to where, reasonably, Julian ends up talking to Leon, and ultimately it gets to the point where uh, Julie or Leon ends up almost falling off of his roof because it seems like he's going to jump, and then Leon is trying to save him, and ultimately Julian is trying to save him because he's like the only person that could help him at this point. So we have Leon that is slipping from this balcony, and Julian is holding on via this guy's shoes, but ultimately the shoes fall, and ultimately so does Leon. Well, ultimately, like Julian is holding on to everything but every bit of this guy's shoes, but ultimately the rest of his body just eventually falls and dies. Because that's what happens when you fall from a high thing, you die. So Julian ultimately gets arrested, seemingly accused for Leon's death, but ultimately, like, dude, he didn't try to cause his death. Ultimately, it just happened, and he was just there. So we ultimately have it to where ultimately Julian is getting arrested and seemingly gonna be probably tried for double murder at some point, but ultimately he's like, dude, this guy was I was trying to save him. Like, dude, he was jumping off his balcony and I was trying to help him. But ultimately we find that reasonably Michelle ends up giving Julian an alibi for that time. For that time of which that he was ultimately supposed to be killing some other woman. Michelle mentions like, dude, I'm gonna give you an alibi. Or I'll give you an alibi so that way you can be like, because ultimately I love you, and ultimately I'm leaving my husband for you. To ultimately we have it to where Julian is talking uh, to Michelle in prison, and ultimately he's like, okay, well, this is great then, because ultimately I'll just be like done with all this prison time and whatever. And so ultimately, like, Julian was not going to try to give up his women, because ultimately we have it to where uh, the pimps for ultimately mention is like, dude, like all your women are thinking that you're hot right now. That ultimately like you're just gonna like turn them in and whatever. So because we have it to where ultimately Julian goes back and to talk to the girl that he ultimately had an alibi for, and she ultimately mentioned she's like, "Yeah, the cops came here, and they asked me so many questions, and like I bet that girl felt traumatized by that whole thing." But ultimately, it's like, yeah, like I did tell the truth. But ultimately, yeah, that's where this kind of movie just breaks down into just being a scandal and some interesting things going on. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I wish that they would have really focused on the whole Gigolo thing. Kind of like, I think they kind of really just like after the first half of this, they didn't know where else to go, so they're just like murder mystery. That always works out. Okay, sure, let's go that route. Um, I thought that was kind of weird. I'm like, dude, you could have really marinated on this whole American Gigolo thing, and ultimately could have had either a very possessive client, or ultimately you could have just had more complicated or interesting clients for Richard Gere to deal with. And ultimately, that could have turned out horrible. That could have been an interesting story, but they didn't go that route. So, anyways, I think that's all that I need to say about this review. I liked the movie. I thought it was an enjoyable thing. I didn't think any like there was a lot of jumbling around. I think towards the end of it of like uh, especially the whole scandal thing, and plus like there's a lot of just like jumbling around with all that crap. Like towards more the end of like there I think was like too many women, and like I think like they weren't all different enough, I think, to be brutally honest. But other than that, I think I'm gonna call that one of this review a wrap here. I just enjoyed this movie, and I think ultimately this movie eventually would probably have to be more than one viewing to really fully and fledgedly grasp the entire film. But other than that, I'm gonna grasp my way out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.